So we have today two speakers, Sarah Brown from Amber, which is an independent energy think tank. Sarah heads up Amber's European fossil fuels team, and before joining Amber, she also has been an energy trader for 15 years. We also have Kjell Kuhne with us. He's the director of the Leave It in the Ground initiative, which aims at accelerating the fossil fuel endgame. As a PhD fellow at the University of Leeds, he also co-authored the recent paper named Carbon Bombs Mapping Key Fossil Fuels Projects. So we will have a bit under 40 minutes of presentation, and we will discuss why fossil gas cannot be considered as a transition fuel. We will also discuss some new fossil gas projects that are currently under development, and why now is the time for ambitious gas exclusion policies. And then hopefully we will manage to have a 20 minutes Q&A session. And I think, Sarah, you can start with your presentation.
Great, thanks. Can you see that fine? Yep. Great. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks to Reclaim Finance for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm going to look at the role of gas in the energy transition. I work with Amber, which, as has been mentioned, it's an energy and climate think tank focused on the clean power transition. So I'm going to look at specifically why fossil gas is no longer viable as a transition fuel, which has been labelled in the past. And I'm going to look at it from 3 different angles and then summarise the EU crisis response at the end. So let's look at the climate implications for gas. So there has been an argument that fossil gas is clean. I think it is not clean. If we look at this from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective and a CO2 emissions perspective, it's still emitting, although less than coal, it's still high in emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions. So if we specifically look at the EU, Amber did some analysis on the EU ETS emissions, the power sector emissions, 72 million tonnes in 2021. Gas in heat and power sectors, that was 168 million tonnes. And if we look here, the chart on the right is showing the country breakdown, and we'll see that Italy is leading the way on amount of million tonnes of CO2 emissions for 2021. And in fact, gas made up 65% of Italy's power sector emissions in 2021. That number is 49% in Spain, 48% in France, and 44% in the Netherlands. So we're still seeing a large proportion of total emissions coming from gas power generation. And then there was also some analysis from HEAL looking at the pollution implications and the health implications of using gas and burning gas for power generation. Their analysis found it caused around 2,800 premature deaths in 2019 and cost the EU 8.7 billion euros in health costs. So not generally what I would define as clean. And here I've just put a quick chart together of the CO2 emissions by EU utility. And we see that ENGIE has emissions of 16 million tonnes, and that is larger than some countries' gas emissions, such as the Netherlands. And then when we're considering gas and its climate impacts, we can't just consider its CO2 emissions. We've got the methane emissions and particularly fugitive emissions in there. Estimates are that methane is responsible for 30% of global warming, and the global energy sector accounts for 40% of those methane emissions from human activity, equating to 135 million tonnes in 2021. Now, a lot of these emissions are fugitive emissions, specifically from the oil and gas sector. And we've seen from the IEA's latest global methane tracker report that actually energy sector methane emissions, although already high, could be underestimated by 70%, up to 70%, above what's reported to the UNFCCC. And I believe that that's mainly because what's reported the UNFCCC doesn't include methane from leakages and fugitive emissions. The IEA also found that based on current natural gas prices and the prices that we saw in 2021, most of the options to reduce these methane emissions from oil and gas operations worldwide could be implemented at no net cost. And in fact, there's a good quote here that methane leaks in 2021, if captured and marketed, would have made additional 180 BCM of gas available to the market. And that could have comfortably eased today's price pressures. So that's an interesting find by the IEA. And on the right, you'll see there's a chart that's looking at the most intensive, methane emissions intensive LNG. The data showing that US is, and with the current diversification of gas supplies, with US being one of the key partners with the EU, that is going to become an even greater problem from an emission standpoint. So how does it look when we look at the global climate targets and Paris Agreement alignment? So what are the requirements and what are the scenarios? So IPCC says global greenhouse emissions must be reduced by 43% by 2030 and by 85% by 2050. And within that, CO2 and methane emissions must fall by 48 and 34% by 2030, respectively. In addition to that, for no 1.5 degree overshoot, peak CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions must happen before 2025. Now, if we're building more gas infrastructure and more gas plants, then that would suggest that we're not going to hit peak emissions prior to 2025. And then there's also the point that the IPCC have made that estimates of future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructures, so that's just no new fossil fuel infrastructures, already exceed the remaining cumulative net CO2 emissions that will limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and calls for decommissioning and reduced utilisation of existing fossil fuel installations in the power sector, as well as cancellation of new installations. And this is supported by a recent Oil Change International report that found that some existing, even existing oil and gas and coal extraction sites need to be shut down. From an IEA net zero scenario perspective, we need clean net zero emissions electricity by 2035 in advanced economies. So therefore, we need the phasing out of unabated fossil gas by 2035 throughout the EU and advanced economies. We also see a big fall in global gas demand and a call that says that there should be no new coal mines or oil and gas fields developed. So we've seen targets as well outside what the IEA and IPCC are saying. We've got Canada, Germany, the UK and the US committing to clean power by 2035. Got the G7, predominantly decarbonised electricity by 2035 commitment. Fit for 55 requires greenhouse gas emissions to be cut by at least 55% by 2030. And REPowerEU recently increased the renewable energy target to 45% by 2030. So all of these scenarios and all of these targets are not conducive to the continued use or any increased use in fossil gas. So what we need is that shift both in finance and in investments away from fossil fuels and towards these low carbon technologies, because trillions of euros is required to get us away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. So looking at it from an economics perspective, I don't think anyone needs telling what's been happening with the gas price since around the middle of last year, and these high prices and volatility are sustained, and with the war in Ukraine, uncertainties about what's happening will happen in future with the gas price remain. So what does that mean for using gas to produce power? Well, for quite some time now, it's not been economically viable. It's been a lot more expensive than using hard coal even and lignite. So we see that from current forward prices, we see that continuing until at least 2025, 2024 in terms of hard coal, and maybe out to 2026 in terms of lignite. So what's interesting about this is that by the time some of the key new gas infrastructure that's been talked about or any new power plants come online, they won't come on in time to alleviate the current energy crisis, and they also won't come on in time for when gas is switching back to being economical. And by that point, a lot of the gas demand will have been eroded by the bringing on of renewables and energy efficiency measures. So Ember recently did a report with Bellona, E3G and RAP that looked at reducing Russian gas demand, well, any gas demand, but specifically Russian gas demand by 2025. The REPowerEU had a target of 2027, and we found that actually could be done earlier. So we really see that there's going to be an eating into gas demand by 2025, and therefore it really questions the economics of any gas used for power generation. So we looked at this from an energy efficiency perspective, heat pumps, electrification perspective, and also from actual increase in renewable electricity, particularly from solar power. And so we found that they could reduce Russian gas imports by 2025 and also use less diversified gas than was stipulated in REPowerEU. They had 60 BCM, and our analysis found that maximum of 51 BCM would be required. And looking again at the economic side of it, we've got scenarios from both Ember, a report that just came out today, and BNEF's energy transition outlook that came out in April, really showing how wind, solar, batteries is going to eat into that gas demand. And this also suggests, and it implies, that renewables is also going to be more reliable and can provide that flexible bulk generation that people often argue cannot happen. The analysis by BNEF and Ember is saying that that's not strictly true, particularly in 2030 and then moving forward to 2035. There's going to be a huge drop in that requirement for gas for power generation. And this report from Carbon Tracker Initiative that came out in December, this was before, obviously before the Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine, and it's before we saw some even greater spikes in gas prices. And they're showing again that by 2025, 2026, renewables will be able to compete to provide that flexible power. And then just a little case study that in gas-reliant Italy, that I just shown how much of their emissions are from gas, and we all know they're reliant on gas. Even there, the tide is turning. I'm taking Enel as an example here. They came out last year and committed to a gas phase out by 2040. They've abandoned plans to convert two coal plants in Italy from coal to gas. And interestingly, even the transmission system operator Turner rejected another one of their coal to gas conversions, Brindisi Sud, because it did not consider that the additional capacity is required. So again, really questioning the economics of gas plants and conversions to gas plants and using gas as a transition fuel. Very interesting quote from Enel's CEO, basically saying that burning gas to produce electricity today is stupid, and that we would definitely see a dent in gas consumption going forward in the next 2 or 3 years. And then obviously something that's discussed a lot since the invasion and since the war began is the security of supply issue. It was already a slight issue with the price rises last year, but now with the cutting off of gas into Europe and also the threat of more reductions in gas supply from Russia, then there are big security of supply questions and concerns. Just taking this snapshot from Eurostat, just indicating how reliant the EU is on imported fossil fuels rather than domestic production. So the blue one is the gas one. So you just see very high proportion of imports, which naturally affects, puts them in the hands of people, causes of geopolitical risks, and we're seeing the effects of that now. I think everyone will have heard a lot about what fossil fuel the EU is most reliant on from Russia, that being gas, with 40% of EU gas coming from Russia in 2021. Less reliant on coal and oil, but still reliant. And the Europe Beyond Coal network has produced a tracker that has a look at how much is currently being spent in 2022 on Russian gas and Russian fossil fuels. Estimated when I looked yesterday, 26 billion euros so far this year. And apparently Russia exported 55.5 billion worth of gas in 2021 to the EU. So we've got the countries there highlighting which countries are spending the most on gas, with Germany leading, but then they have a very large demand. Italy up there again, and Czechia also spending a lot of money on Russian gas. This is just a quick snapshot to give an idea again of which countries, give a breakdown in Europe of which countries are most reliant on gas. So we really see that clearly Germany's out the lead then, and that's why there's a lot of talk at the moment about their supply issues and what they're going to do about it. But there is also an awful lot of other European countries reliant on Russian gas. So what has been the EU response to the energy crisis and also to the war? I think what we've seen is a real heightened urgency to end all fossil fuel dependence and to accelerate that clean energy transition. We've seen REPowerEU do a Fit for 55 policy package update, very extensive. They want to cut Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the end of 2022. But actually, above and beyond that, they're saying they want to cut total gas consumption by 235 billion cubic meters by 2027 and 310 billion cubic meters by 2030. So we're seeing a real sustained effort and push to get off fossil fuels, in particular off gas supply, and reduce that demand. So the plan is to end all Russian fossil fuel imports by 2027, with the oil embargo coming in the end of 2022 and coal coming in August. And interestingly, they're saying this will enable them to save 100 billion euros each year on fossil fuel imports, which it will be money that can be spent on the clean transition instead. They said they're going to need 300 billion investment by 2030. And only 10 billion of that is going to be on fossil infrastructure. The rest is for clean energy. So really we're seeing gas from an EU policy perspective also not being viewed as a viable bridging fuel. This is a snapshot of how REPowerEU plans to reduce gas consumption by 2030. Multiple different ways. You see quite a high reliance on hydrogen, which has caused a bit of discussion, obviously, but you'll see how they're trying to reduce it above and beyond that Russian gas imports, which is the red line on there. Renewables is definitely increasing. There is some concern that the renewables increase. Some of that will be used for hydrogen production, green hydrogen production, rather than direct use in the electricity sector, which would actually be better from a climate perspective.
Sarah, sorry, I just wanted to highlight that we should be moving toward the end of the presentation.
I'm getting there. Okay, Claire, thanks. There's been a lot of discussion around coal power generation, obviously recently, because of Germany's announcement, Austria, the Netherlands, UK, saying they might keep plants on longer or bring plants out of reserve. Most people in REPowerEU and ourselves at Ember, we're seeing this as a temporary switch. We're still seeing commitments to the 2030 phase out by Germany. We've seen Romania bring it forward. We've seen Czechia stay with its 2033 phase out, and we've not seen the Netherlands say anything about changing their 2029 phase out. And so REPowerEU is really seeing that accelerated clean electricity deployment. I won't read all this out because you'll be bored and because time constraints, but renewables capacity should reach 1,236 gigawatts by 2030. The share of electricity production should be 69% renewables by 2030. And clean power, including nuclear, 87% of electricity production. So a huge shift towards clean power. And countries were already moving. We're looking here at something that takes their NECPs in 2019 versus any announcements since, including any very recent ones. And we've seen everyone pretty much shift up in increasing their ambitions with regard to renewable electricity and renewable share of electricity by 2030. So that's fantastic. Another contentious thing is about the new gas import infrastructure. Multiple studies have found that import infrastructure, particularly fixed LNG terminals, are not required. IEA have even said that the current EU LNG import capacity is underutilised. I believe the next speaker will probably speak about this in more detail around projects that are coming online, so I won't go on about this. But yeah, there's a lot of studies saying that the new fixed gas import infrastructure is not required. And then concluding, so the current crisis has acted as a catalyst for the accelerated EU clean energy transition, and it's seen as the solution to both energy security and the climate emergency. So there is this clear recognition that all fossil fuels bring substantial economic, geopolitical and climate risks, including gas, whereas renewables are a clean, cheap, homegrown solution to those problems. And despite switches to coal and fossil fuel use, potentially, the EC has come out and said they're confident that climate ambitions will be reached due to huge and rapid ramp up in renewables deployment. And that's me. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And then, Kjell, I think you can present your presentation.
Okay.
So in the meantime, I just wanted to say that we have received already some questions, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. We should be able to have like around 15 to 20 minutes Q&A session.
Okay, I can see my presentation up there. I wanted to invite our participants, if you don't mind sharing your video, to turn on your video, because I like to look at some faces while I speak to see if you know, there are any reactions or quizzle looks. So if you don't mind, please feel free to turn on your cameras. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to join this session on a very timely and interesting topic. I also have about 20 minutes, so let me jump right in and start with while I believe that fossil gas investments are not only dangerous for the climate, but also for investors. And I will give a little bit of a wider context, focusing on the fossil age to start with. And if you only take one thing home from my presentation today, I would like it to be this number, 350. There is an organization by that name, 350.org, which I imagine some of you have come across already. If you have come across 350.org, I would invite you to write into the chat if you know what 350.org stands for. So this number has been called the most important number on Earth. And okay, I can already see a good response. It's 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that is a CO2 concentration that has been identified in the planetary past of Earth as a limit. When we were above that for an extended period of time, Earth would shift to a hot state. That means more than 8 degrees warming, so 8 degrees warmer than now, no ice on the poles, and sea levels 60 meters higher than currently. So that is where runaway climate change would take us if we stay above 350 parts per million, and that has happened in the past. So if that's the safe limit for the operating space of humankind on planet Earth, then my next question is, where are we right now with CO2 levels in the atmosphere? And again, I would like to invite you to write into the chat. I know we have many experts working on climate and environmental topics. Please send your best guess of where we're at with CO2 levels right now. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. 420. I think Matt won a prize. We are at 420, and that is very concerning because it means we are in the danger zone. We are in a situation where we are potentially facing this runaway climate change that we can't even stop if we don't emit anything, and we need to get back into the safe zone. We need to get back down below 350 parts per million. Now, the important question is, how can we do that? What do we have to do to get there? If your first thought is reducing emissions, then you're wrong. Because reducing emissions means instead of shooting up further, we are increasing CO2 levels at a slower rate, but we're still increasing them. Reducing emission assumes we are continuing to emit, we are continuing to burn fossil fuels, and that will not get us below 350 ppm. So in order to get below 350 parts per million, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to go to zero carbon, and then we need to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere by regrowing forests, by building up soils with more carbon and things like that. And that also explains why offsetting is not a good idea, because it allows more fossil carbon to be taken out while wasting that opportunity of using natural landscapes for absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. So going to zero carbon and stopping burning of fossil fuels is just the first step on the path towards re-establishing a certain amount of climate stability on our planet. And the Paris Agreement with the 1.5 degree target is just a very reasonable way to limit us from going too deep into the danger zone. So having said that, that we need to go to zero carbon to have any chance of getting back down in the future, it's good to look at the claims of the fossil gas industry again, because they say it's low carbon natural gas. Now that won't help us. That is the old reducing emissions thinking. And to compare it with a situation, it's as if we were pouring fuel on the fire and we say, oh, but you know, our fuel is low carbon, our fuel is natural gas. And that doesn't fix the problem anymore. And even that claim is also contentious, as we will see in the next section, where I will talk a little bit more about methane. Now, methane is an interesting animal. Out of the 1.2 degrees warming that we are currently experiencing on the planet, methane is responsible for half a degree. And that is quite a lot, because CO2 has raised temperatures by 0.75 and methane 0.5. So it's almost as severe as CO2, but we're not talking that much about methane as we are about CO2. So why is that? And it has something to do with methane being much less than CO2. And I would like to ask, but it's more potent, and I would like to ask you another question, where you can put in the chat how many times more potent methane is for heating the planet compared to CO2. When you put 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere and 1 ton of methane, how many times more potent is methane? Okay, I see a couple of guesses already, circling around 20, 30. The answer is 120 times. Now, why are we getting so low numbers? That is because you have probably been reading the IPCC reports, and there are numbers of 21 in 1996 for over 100-year time frame, and different numbers also for 20 years. 86 is the highest. The gas industry tends to use 21, and the fossil gas opponents tend to use the 86 number, but this is all over longer time frames than the methane is actually there. So methane, as it is in the atmosphere, is 120 times more potent than CO2, and it starts degrading very quickly. And if you measure it over 100 years, you are diluting its effect by combining the moments when it's there with the long time when it's not there anymore, and that's why you get so low numbers. Now, the half-life, as somebody already mentioned in the chat, and that is a very interesting thing, is 7.6 years. So that means after emitting, after 7.5 years, half of it is gone. And that is a very interesting property of methane, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for millennia. And methane is gone very quickly. In fact, half the methane in the atmosphere was emitted starting 2015, so the year of the Paris Agreement until now. That's the methane emissions we're looking at there is what contributed to having now half a degree of warming. And if you turn that around, it means that if we stop emitting methane today, in just 7.5 years, we will see temperatures drop from that methane contribution. So it is actually a very powerful potential for confronting the climate emergency with a tool that can actually make temperatures react. CO2 is not so responsive, methane is. So there is a powerful tool there that we're not really looking at yet. In fact, we are going in the other direction, and that is what I will talk a little bit now. There are still huge methane fossil gas projects being put in the pipeline. This piece of research on the carbon bombs is something we published, I've been involved with, and we published very recently. If you read The Guardian, you may have seen it on the front page that seemed to be burning. If you read Le Monde or Der Spiegel, you may also have come across it. I think you will not have come across it in the New York Times, because I missed an email by the New York Times journalist, but it got some good coverage. And what we did, it's not very complicated actually. What we did, we just asked the question, what are the biggest fossil fuel projects in the world? And we went through two databases, one for oil and gas and one for coal, and pulled out these projects, coal mines and oil and gas fields, that have the potential of emitting over 1 billion ton of CO2 over their lifetimes. And we found 400 of these projects, and we published the list with names and with calculations of their potential emissions. And what we found is that these 400 projects, half oil and gas, half coal, combined, have the potential to emit twice as much as we could under a 1.5 degree carbon budget. And another very interesting thing that we found is that 40% of these projects are new and haven't started. And that is an opportunity for stopping these carbon bombs that will make it impossible to meet the Paris Agreement targets. Now, I know that most of you work in the financial sector, so I would like to talk a little bit about the economics of these carbon bombs. Climate change has been called the biggest market failure by Sir Nicholas Stern, and that has to do with the fact that there are huge externalities that the market is not pricing in. And my friend and colleague Shivan Karta from the Stockholm Environment Institute has run those numbers for investments by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And what he has found is that for $1 invested, they would be generating over $10 of damages. And that is using a relatively low social cost of carbon of $128 per ton of CO2. We have recently done some similar calculations for a very high value fossil fuel, which is oil from Saudi Arabia, and they can make over $100 of profit for a barrel of oil at current prices, but they are generating $175 of damages just through climate change, with an updated social cost of carbon of $400 per ton. Now, interestingly, they also create $20 of damages just inside Saudi Arabia, just inside their own country. So that is quite a dysfunctional system where you are creating much bigger externalities than you are generating benefit. And the carbon bomb projects are looking at extending that way into the future. So by definition, a carbon bomb project is so big that it takes years to prepare and it takes decades to implement. And if you invest, the break-even point will be somewhere on some part on this way down here. And the moment when this project actually generates a reasonable return on your investment that would make it competitive with other investments is further down the line. So this means that if today you invest in a new carbon bomb project, you are betting that humankind will maintain this dysfunctional situation of maintaining these huge externalities for decades into the future. And I think that that is a risky assumption, that is a risky bet, and I would question that. Now, we have looked at the overall picture of emissions, and we said, how could we bring this in line with the climate targets? And we said new carbon bombs should be a priority for stopping, and existing ones should be put in harvest mode. Harvest mode means that you do not invest new money. You just keep the fossil fuel flowing from existing wells and through existing infrastructure, for example. And when you do that for these carbon bombs that already exist, the picture gets much more in line with a 1.5 scenario. Some early closure will also be needed, as Sarah already mentioned, especially for coal mines, but also for oil and gas projects. But the more we build now, the more we will have to close early, because it is a zero-sum game. For a carbon budget, there is no free lunch. If Germany burns lignite, Saudi Arabia will have to leave oil in the ground. That's the arithmetics. Now let's look at one of the companies that are still building new carbon bombs. This is TotalEnergies, and they are involved with 25 carbon bomb projects in the world, and 6 of them are new projects. And you know that we are witnessing a war in Ukraine at the moment, and the casualties of that war are in the tens of thousands. And if you look at climate-related deaths, actually, it turns out that for 1 gigaton of CO2, it turns out that you will be getting 11,000 climate-related deaths over the course of the century. So that means that each of the projects is on a scale, like on a similar scale as wars being fought right now. And that is a huge responsibility for a company like Total to be, setting off these projects and causing these impacts. Nevertheless, they still push ahead. Just a few days ago, they signed a contract and were happily, celebrating the setting off of a new fossil gas carbon bomb in the midst of a historic heat wave in France, and in a country, Qatar, that is going to become unlivable in summer over the course of the century because of climate change. And they do so emboldened by the higher fossil fuel prices, the higher gas prices because of the Ukraine war. And they think they are smart and they will be earning a lot of money. But as I said, for a carbon bomb project, you have to be thinking in decades. You cannot be thinking in years. You have to be thinking in decades. And times are changing. And I will look a little bit at the end game, because I think that it's really risky to think that over decades this situation will continue. So,
sorry, Kjell, I just wanted also to highlight that we should be moving towards the end of your presentation if we want to have a Q&A session.
Yes, I will be moving to the end very swiftly. So there is a cultural shift already underway, and it has started with language, shifting from natural gas to fossil gas. I have been involved in that process myself, and in the meantime, even the European Commission is using that language. We've seen the global methane pledge in Glasgow with a 30% reduction by 2030 as a first target. That is not enough, but it does show that regulators are starting to turn that way, to look at methane and what to do about it, and identifying it as an opportunity for faster action on climate. And we will see more of that. You know that the IEA, Sarah has mentioned it, has said that we need no new fossil fuel projects for net zero, and public finance institutions are responding to that. We also saw a big commitment in Glasgow, and Japan has just recently joined to complete the G7 in committing no new fossil fuel infrastructure in their overseas finance. If you listen to the Secretary General and how he speaks about fossil fuels and fossil fuel investments, you get a sense that this is something that is going very fast in a certain direction. And I think that the private finance has to catch up to that new reality. On the Reclaim Finance website, you can find some of the pioneers who have already adopted progressive policies to exclude oil and gas. I would encourage you to take a look at these and understand how these work, and then go and overtake these in ambition with your own commitments and your own policies in your institutions. On the way forward, to conclude, there were some very complicated numbers and concepts in this presentation, but there is a piece of good news. What to do with it is actually quite simple, and that is, don't invest in new fossil fuel projects. So zero carbon is the new direction, and we need to get there very swiftly. So that is a very simple take-home message. The second point is to be wary of the downside risk of fossil gas, of methane, because of the dynamics, because of the opportunity in shutting it down quickly, and all of the damages it causes, which make it into a target for regulatory action, and let alone the climate activists. And the third is get ahead of the curve. This decarbonization is already underway, and if you want to do well, you should get ahead of a curve and ride that wave rather than getting crushed by it. So in this historic moment of arsonists versus firefighters, the good thing is that you get to choose which side you're on. You get to choose where you put your money, where you invest, and I would invite you to consider joining the team firefighters and not put more money into fossil fuels and fossil gas. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So thank you, Kjell, for your presentation. We do already have some questions, but I invite you to ask for more if you have any questions that are not answered yet. So the first question we have is about gas phase out. So someone asked and said that needing zero carbon electricity does not follow that gas must be zero emissions by the same time, since gas is used for more than power generation. I don't know if Kjell or Sarah, you want to answer this?
I can start. I'm not sure what the question is. It sounds like a statement, but I will try and answer it. I think if it's referring to my presentation, I was focusing on the power sector because that's Ember's area of expertise. And I think what it's shown is for net zero emissions, it's not just the power sector that needs to drop. And I think that the other presentation has shown that, is that there's, yes, I focused on power sector emissions, But with gas, it's not just the carbon emissions, it's greenhouse gas emissions, it's methane, and we're not presuming it's just used for the power sector. It is obviously used for heating, etc., and industry. But the overall momentum is not just to move it away from the power generation sector, but to change the way we use it in households, in industry, heating. I don't think the momentum's just on the power sector. And I believe that there's the overall targets from the IPCC and the IEA and the 1.5% alignment is very clear that it is a reduction in use of fossil fuels, including gas. That's all uses of fossil fuels, not just in the power sector.
Yeah, I can only support that. I think there are a number of uses of fossil gas, and there are alternatives to them, and these can be accelerated, and they are being accelerated. And I think that's the key dynamic. There's also an interesting perspective on fossil gas and oil, that it's burning it is not a very smart use, because these materials, they could be used to generate much higher value in a circular economy. But as of now, fossil fuel companies are quite far away from identifying that as an opportunity to get more value out of these materials. But I think in the longer term, that could be a smarter use of those materials than to burn them down.
Okay, so we do have another question, which is about the justification for some very limited conditional investment in gas in developing countries. The person is saying, given the difficulties in scaling renewables for population currently that do not have currently access to electricity, how do you see the role of gas in developing countries balancing the need to bring down the overall carbon budget with a globally just transition?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That is a very good question, because we're talking from a global north perspective. We've been using fossil fuels all our lives. Now that discourse, that argument that poor people need fossil fuels, is an industry discourse that poor people themselves do not share. So if you look at electrification, for those people who do not have access to electricity, renewables are the way to go. And so if, for example, right now we're seeing this dash for gas in Africa, and it is the elites that want to fill their pockets that are asking for fossil gas projects. It is the fossil fuel companies that want to do these projects and fill their pockets that are asking for that. And they're using the argument that poor people would need that for their well-being, to push that forward. But if you look at the reality of these countries, that is not the way to go if you are really concerned about the well-being of the poor majorities in African or other developing countries.
So can I just add to that? Sorry. Yeah, as well. I think another thing we're seeing is the issues related to hydrogen as well. So you've got, in particular, where people are trying to source hydrogen. The concern is that renewable energy that could be used to, electrify and provide power and heat for the people there is actually going to be used for hydrogen that's going to be exported back to Europe, and that's also not an ideal situation. It's something that should be avoided.
So we do have another question. I think we have time for just 2 more questions. One of them is, which are the biggest sources of methane emissions and how to minimize them? If you can answer that.
Yes, I assume that you refer to anthropogenic methane emissions, and there we have the energy industry with oil and gas extraction, and the whole supply chain, actually, because there's lots of leaks along the supply chain. Coal mining also leaks methane. Then we have agriculture. So wet rice farming is a significant source. We have cows, which by their digestion produce a lot of methane. Also deforestation. and landfills are a huge source of methane emissions. So it's a mix, but the energy sector is the biggest player in there, along with agriculture.
Okay, so thank you. And I think we have time for just one last remark. I think, Sarah, it was when you were speaking, so I think maybe you should be the one to answer it. So the Ukraine war is showing a new problem of supply security versus economic efficiency. And could you kindly elaborate on it?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I think we're seeing unprecedented times and emergency measures, and it's understandable for the EU governments to at first looking to diversify gas supply, and now obviously with getting the gas supply, threats of the gas supply being totally cut off, their priorities have to be filling the gas storage prior to the winter coming. So we've got Germany with a goal, I think, of 80% by the 1st of October to fill up the storage. So we've got needing to get gas supplies in for that from alternative sources, which may not be that people are having to buy at very high prices, as gas is being cut off to people having to buy a gas on the market at high prices to cover existing contracts. So we are seeing emergency measures rather than due to the war in Ukraine, rather than just focusing on the economic efficiency and the economic viability of things. So I think that's understandable as well. It hasn't yet been quantified, but will the switching to coal, if that's required, is that going to be more costly? What's that going to cost? Or is actually the fact that they're burning coal rather than burning gas going to be economically beneficial? But we will see. That's still to be determined on how much coal is going to be used and how much those coal plants may generate, and that's all dependent on what's going to happen, and we don't know yet exactly what's happening there. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, so I think we have answered all the questions in the chat. If you have any more questions, I will just put in the chat my email and Andrea's email, and then you can just send us more questions. And I also wanted to remind you that we have another webinar next week on liquefied natural gas. So it will be on the same day next week, on Wednesday at the same time, so from 4 to 5. And we will address also the current European situation around LNG, as well as do a short focus on US shale gas. So I'm going to also share the link of this webinar in the chat in case you want to join and didn't receive the invitation. I think this is it, apart from that. So thank you all for joining, and special thanks for Kiel and Sarah for your great presentation and also answering all the questions. And I hope everyone will join us